I'll be reading Mark 2:23 through 3:6 from the New Revised Standard Version. One Sabbath he was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need of food? He entered the house of God when Abiathar was high priest and ate the bread of the presence, which it is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and he gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, 'The Sabbath was made for humankind, and not humankind for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath.' Again he entered the synagogue, and a man was there who had a withered hand. They watched him to see whether he would cure him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man who had the withered hand, 'Come forward.' Then he said to them, 'Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to kill?' But they were silent. He looked around at them with anger. He was grieved at their hardness of heart and said to the man, 'Stretch out your hand.' He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately conspired with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God."
If you ask me, the creation account, as found in Genesis, ends rather anticlimactically. I mean, it's nothing but pure wonder and glory for the first 6 days. God says, "Let there be light," and there's light. A greater light and a lesser light, and a first dawn and a first dusk and a first crescent moon. Aardvarks and chrysanthemums, penguins and oak trees. I imagine the echo of the first wave lapping upon a shore, or the first time a breeze rustled through a field of prairie grass. And then on day 6, God created 2 people bearing God's image, both male and female, bearing His image. Opposable thumbs and frontal cortexes and heads and shoulders and knees and toes. And it was all glorious. And as the story continues to rise to a crescendo on the 7th day, you're on the edge of your seat. If all that happened in the first 6 days, what will happen on day 7? Only for the story to say this: by the 7th day, God completed His work which He had done, and He rested on the 7th day from all His work which He had done. Then God blessed the 7th day and sanctified it, made it holy, because in it He rested from all His work which God had created and made. On the 7th day, at the pinnacle of creation, the height of creation's drama, God took a nap. And yet even when God did nothing, God created something. And it's not just God who took this day of rest seriously. God's people took it seriously too. Shabbat, they called it, Sabbath. It's related to the Hebrew words for seventh and rest. The Sabbath, Shabbat, was a day of rest. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy, it says in the 10 Commandments. It's sort of surprising to think about it that way. It's right up there with no other gods before me and don't murder. Rest. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. It's a command of God. Not just a physician's prescription or a psychologist's order. It's a command of God. The way it's told in the book of Exodus when they give the 10 Commandments, the people of Israel are to observe Sabbath by remembering God's pattern in creating the world. God rested on the 7th day, therefore we should too. It's part of how God made the stuff of life. The way the book of Deuteronomy tells it when the 10 Commandments are given, the people aren't so much to remember creation as they are to remember their exodus from Egypt. Remember, Deuteronomy tells them, remember when you were slaves in Egypt. Remember when you were judged only by what you could produce, and it was just work, work, work all the time. You didn't have a name, just an employee ID number. Remember that. and thereby practice the Sabbath by letting everything rest. Your employees, your animals. The text says, let your animals rest. How about that? The dirt, let the dirt rest. The stranger in your midst, let everybody rest. Let it be a day of social leveling, no bosses or underlings. Everybody gets to rest on this day because we're not God's servants on this day, we're God's children on this day. In other places in the Hebrew law, breaking the Sabbath was punishable by death. I say all that to say the Jewish people took their Sabbath, their rest, very, very, very seriously. During the century just before Jesus' birth, there was a group of people amongst the Jews who felt like the Jewish people were losing their identity amidst the broader Hellenistic culture, the Greek culture that had spread throughout the world by Alexander the Great. These people wanted the Jewish people to cling to their identity, to be who they were, and not lose themselves. And these folks were called the Pharisees. The word means something like separate ones. The Pharisees wanted the Jewish people to be separate, to be holy. It grew straight out of their Bible. They wanted them to be different from all the other people in all the other cultures. And the means by which they were to be different was strict adherence to the law. The Sabbath command to the Pharisees was very, very, very important. It's in the Ten Commandments, for crying out loud. We must take this seriously. And while the law commanded the Jewish people to observe the Sabbath, it didn't give them much direction in how to do so. What is work exactly? Is work the same for all of us? When does work become work? When does play become work? How should we rest? You can't strictly adhere to something that's ambiguous. And so the Pharisees sought about to make clear what in the law was ambiguous. They offered some clarity. To be clear, the Pharisees did not wake up, according to the way most people talk about them today, and say, how legalistic can we be today? How miserable can we make people? That wasn't what they were after. The Pharisees did wake up every morning and say, we love God, and therefore we love God's law, and we want people to keep God's law strictly so that they will be holy and God will be pleased. And the Sabbath is one of those laws. This is the context behind the stories that Beverly just read this morning. Jesus and His disciples in the first story are walking through the fields picking grain. As you're probably aware, in the Mediterranean world, farmers would leave the outskirts of their fields unharvested so that any travelers, any strangers, any poor folks who did not have food to eat could walk on the outskirts of the fields and find food and grain. It was an ancient form of social security, you could say. However, picking grain was one of the categories of work that the Pharisees strictly forbade. They began to complain, and in response to their complaints, Jesus reminds them of King David and his soldiers who, when they were hungry and away from home on one occasion, ate the showbread, the bread that was only for the priest. And because that bread was usually prepared the day before the Sabbath, the presumption here is that they were eating this bread on the Sabbath because they were hungry, they were starving. And the argument here is from the lesser to the greater. If David's hunger could override the pietistic rules of his day, Jesus could too. The humanitarian need superseded the religious directive because the humanitarian need was the purpose behind it all to begin with. In other words, the Sabbath was made for humanity, not humanity for the Sabbath. The Sabbath was meant to be a blessing, not a burden. It was meant to lift our spirits, not weigh us down. It was meant to make us more human, not less. In the mind of God, people take precedence over piety. And if there ever was a day to be reminded of that, it's the Sabbath. And in the next story, Jesus walks into the synagogue only to find a man there who had a withered hand. The eyes of the Pharisees are upon Jesus to see if He's going to break the law. Pharisaic teaching permitted healing if it was a life or death situation, but not if it was not life or death. If it could wait a day, then healing was considered work. Medical attention was considered work. This man has a withered hand. He's had it for some time. Jesus, wait one day and honor the Sabbath. Jesus saw the man. He also saw the hard-heartedness of the Pharisees. The text says the hard-heartedness. We in our day think of the heart as the seat of emotions, but in the ancient world they thought with their heart. Holy cow, that didn't sound right. The heart was the seat of decisions, not the seat of emotions. What Jesus is mourning here, what He's angry about, is their closed theological systems, their unwillingness to do what's right by people, do best for people, because of their ossified grasp of the truth. And Jesus here seems to push the envelope a bit. He stands the man up like an object lesson, and then says to the crowd, what's lawful on the Sabbath? To do good or evil? To save life or to kill? And He said to the man, stretch out your hand. And he did so, and he was healed. Stretch out your hand, and he was healed. On April 1st, 2002, I was playing intramural football at my college and tore my ACL. Rebecca and I were scheduled to get married June 1st. This was 2 months to the day beforehand. I called her to tell her I tore my ACL. She said, April Fools, ha ha. I said, no, really. She said, you better not be just joking about this. I said, I'm not just joking. The real dilemma for us was that when we got married, our insurance changed over, and then my torn ACL would be a pre-existing condition, and so I had to do something before we got married, but I did not want to be on crutches at my wedding. And so I had surgery as quickly as I could. Surgery was on Thursday. I said, I'll wait till Monday to go to therapy. That'll give me all weekend to rest my knee. I'll feel better on Monday. That was a horrible, horrible decision. I go to therapy on Monday, determined not to be on crutches at my wedding. I cannot remember my therapist's name, but I remember her as Holga. She just reminds me of a Holga. That's what she was like. She laid me on my back and placed my foot flat on the wall as high as I could, and she said, lower your foot as low as you can, bend your knee. And I slowly began to bend my knee and lower my foot. She said, further, with all the compassion of Genghis Khan. I said, that's as far as I can go. I felt like a helpless sacrifice on the table. Things are popping and creaking. And I went as far as I could. Tears are in my eyes. And she puts her hand on my ankle and pushes my foot 10 degrees further down the wall. And I was suddenly filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in tongues. And Holga said to me, come on. She said, what can't be stretched can't be healed. I hated her for that. But it was true. What can't be stretched can't be healed. Jesus said, stretch out your hand. And the man was healed. One can only wonder what the Pharisees would have done had Jesus turned to them and said, stretch out your hearts. I bet that would have hurt some too. In both of these stories, Jesus saw the Sabbath as a time for blessing, a time for renewal, a time for restoration. And in so doing, He was getting at the purpose of the Sabbath, the intention behind the Sabbath. The why of it is what Jesus cared about, not the how of it. And it seems to me that we would be wise to rediscover, or perhaps discover for the very first time, the purpose and intention behind it as well. Last week we talked about work, the dignity of it, the sacredness of it, the call to it. Like Sabbath rest, work is rooted in the creation account. It's part of life, part of the way God made things. In this way, though, work is sort of like water. It's a gift as long as you can come up for air. Work is only a gift when it can be broken by a day of rest and renewal and restoration. And yet, might I suggest to you today that the reason the Sabbath comes to us in the form of a command is because we have such a hard time hearing it. Rest comes hard for us, especially in our culture, particularly in our culture. So long as we measure human worth by production and consumption, then any notion of rest is considered weakness. So long as we feel like the weight of the world is on our shoulders alone, then a nap can be cataclysmic. Do you know how important I am? So long as we view people, including ourselves, through the lens of their accomplishments and or their failures, then the Sabbath is just a cute idea in ancient lore. So long as our identities are found only in our work, then we cannot rest, because whenever we're resting, we don't know who we are. We're human doings, not human beings. And so long as we frantically fill our hectic calendars so that we can avoid probing the depths of our souls because we find ourselves so boring, then the Sabbath will always seem more like a curse than a blessing. But into our rat race, and into our saturated calendars, and into our monotonous weeks, Jesus comes walking along into our lives, offering us the gift of Sabbath, the blessing of rest, a different kind of time. To those who are hungry, really hungry, Jesus says, "Here, take and eat." And to those who are wounded and withered, Jesus says, "Here, stretch out your hand, stretch out your mind, stretch out your soul, stretch out your life, breathe a little." You see, brothers and sisters, the Sabbath is both a gift and a discipline. And while the Pharisees fell into the ditch on one side of the road by turning the gift into burden and rest into work by their rules, we tend to fall into the ditch on the other side of the road, which is that we neglect the thing altogether. Perhaps because we see ourselves functionally as our own gods. There are ditches on both sides of this Sabbath road. But I'm hard-pressed to think of something more life-giving in our culture than blessed rest. A day not just to use creation, but like God did on the seventh day, to just be in it and enjoy it. A day not to get something done, but a day to become something good. A day to stretch out our minds, to lift our gaze, and ponder the things that really are the most important things in our lives. A day to stretch out our souls, to remind ourselves that there is a God and we are not that God. Thanks be to God. It takes the pressure off. A day to laugh, a day to play with a child, to remind ourselves that we are not only God's servants, but we are also God's children. A day to get away from the flat screens and get into God's beautiful world, to stretch out our hearts, to put down our phones, and to look people that we love in their eyes and tell them that they are in fact loved. This summer, I heard Amy Butler, the pastor of Riverside Church in New York City, tell of a recent trip she made to the Holy Land. It was a group of clergy women from the States. They went to the Holy Land to be with Palestinian and Israeli women who were working for peace in the Holy Land. Can you imagine that? So these clergy women are hanging out with Jewish and Muslim women in the Holy Land. One night they were there, they met in a Jewish family's home. And it was the night that Sabbath began. You'll remember that in the Jewish way of thinking, a day begins at night, right? It's why in the creation account it says evening and morning the first day, evening and morning the second day, not morning and evening. Sabbath begins at night. And so they're in this Jewish home, and the family has prepared an incredible Shabbat meal, candles lit, and they enjoy this festive occasion, this festive meal, and after it's over, the man and woman of the house stand up from the table and they walk over to their oldest daughter and they place their hands on her shoulders and they prayed a blessing over her. And after they prayed, they knelt in front of her and they looked her in her eyes and said to her, "Do you know what you mean to us?" And began to whisper encouragement into her ear and affirmation into her ear. And then they went to their second child and did the same, and the third and fourth and fifth. Big family. And then around the table they went to the guests and they prayed blessings over the guests, and they knelt in front of them and looked them in their eye and said, "Do you know how your presence has blessed our home tonight?" And Amy Butler said, "I sat there with tears in my eyes thinking about the holiness of it all." And she said, "It hit me that never in my life, ever, had I experienced anything like that. Ever." And in this home, they did it every week. Brothers and sisters, I cannot think of one more sport or one more dance or one more family activity that could ever compensate, ever, for a sacred rhythm like that, where we looked our children in the eye and told them what they meant to us. That Sabbath at its best, a weekly discipline and a gift from the heavens. To be, to breathe. Abraham Joshua Heschel, the great American rabbi of the 20th century, once wrote that the Sabbath is a temple in time. He says that compared to all the other ancient religions and how the other ancient gods worked, they wanted physical temples, holy space. And we do need holy space. We need places like this to remind us that all places are holy and sacred. But Yahweh, the Jewish God, did not make a space holy. Yahweh made a temple in time. A holy day to remind us that all of our time is holy. Every day, every second, this day, this second is holy time because it is nothing short of a gift from God. And if we waste it in our rampant busyness, it is our lives that we are wasting. And you don't walk into that temple and ask like the Pharisees, what are the rules? You walk into that temple like Jesus and ask, where is the life? Where is the love? Where is the one who rules? You walk into that temple to be a human being, not a human doing. Can I speak to you, pastor, to people just for a second? Every Sunday I stand up here and I look you in your eyes, and I look at working people, busy people, professional people, movers and shakers. I'm grateful for that. I see people who work hard, really blisteringly hard, and I'm grateful for that. My prayer for you is that you don't sacrifice your life on the altar of making a living. I also see people in this room who, even when they're not working, they're giving their blood, sweat, and tears to make this world more like the kingdom of God. Thanks be to God. I give thanks for that. I also pray for you. For what good is it if we change the whole world and lose our souls in the process? What I would want to say to you today, all of you, and me amongst you, is what Jesus said. The Sabbath was made for humanity, not humanity for the Sabbath. So come and stretch out your hands. Stretch out your minds. Stretch out your souls. Stretch out your hearts. Because what cannot be stretched cannot be healed. And all God's people said,